Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Melissa Urich, and I am part of the Upper Susquehanna Coalition's Outreach Committee. I want to welcome you to our final Watershed Wednesdays webinar, hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association. These weekly Watershed Wednesday sessions are taking the place of the annual Upper Susquehanna Watershed Forum for 2020, since we're unable to meet in person. Now onto our session presented by Andrea Armstrong from Lafayette College, and I'll let her take it from here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Armstrong. I'm really excited to be with you today. We are addressing this question of so what? What is it that landowners are interested in when they're thinking about or maybe considering having a riparian conservation project on their property? I wanted to first say that I'm really excited to be part of these Watershed Wednesday webinars because living in Pennsylvania now, my home watershed is the Butternut Creek of Otsego County. And so it's great to be involved with some of the work that you're all doing and to help to inspire some continued work of both my own and of your groups in the future. When landowners are asking, so what, they may or may not be using that exact term, so what, so why should I do this conservation project? But what they're really looking for is some justification. They want to know why should they be planting trees or why should they conserve riparian areas on their property? And we all know through talking with landowners that there are about 1,000, maybe 2,000 ways that you could go about answering this question with landowners. But we really want to pick the most effective response. And so my talk today is thinking mostly about how do we identify the most effective way to communicate and justify riparian buffer conservation with landowners. How is it that we can best reach them and best engage their motivations to encourage their participation? A lot of that is based on landowner attitudes. And if we can understand landowner attitudes, then that gives us a leg up on helping to tailor our messages and outreach for them. So attitudes are super important for guiding all kinds of behaviors. When we think about it in the world of conservation, it's a lot of attitudes that underlie people's motivations. What might bring them to a conversation with a member of your organization, or what might their interests be that they haven't expressed yet, but that might be lying under the surface. Attitudes shape motivations, and motivations really propel behaviors, and that action to sign a contract to have a conservation project on their property. So if we want to understand and think about how we can get to conservation behaviors on private property, it's really important to start at the beginning and consider landowner attitudes. This is something that I'm sure you have done already. And so for those of you who regularly work with landowners, I'd like you to take a minute. We won't take too much time, but just take a minute on your own to yourself and think back to an instance when you've worked closely with a landowner or a client and you felt like you've understood their reasons for implementing a riparian project. I'm a professor and I've been teaching remotely all semester. And so I've done this activity with my students many times to help them put their ideas on paper as a webinar is going on. So just for 30 seconds, think back to that instance when you've worked closely with a landowner or some sort of a private landowning client, and you feel like you've understood their reasons. If you could, in the chat box, please type in what attitudes do you think that landowner was expressing to you at the time that you were working closely with them. And I'm going to navigate my way to be able to look at the chat box. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have a couple ideas of what landowner attitudes might have popped up during these conversations, please share in the chat box. No pressure, there are no right or wrong answers. But where do you think you've encountered a landowner attitude before? Lydia's sharing some habitat improvements that might have been a really important motivation for landowners, that they wanted to improve some habitat on their property. Nice. If anyone else wants to chime in, that's great. Awesome. Yeah, they're paying taxes, and then this is valuable land to them, that they have some really important financial considerations at hand. Fruit trees. Yeah, fruit trees are wonderful and could be have multiple benefits to our property as well. Trout streams. Yeah, cold water fisheries, so important in headwaters. How much money will I get? Show me the benefits in dollar terms. Absolutely. So these are really important motivations, considerations, some judgment. I love it. Pollinators, stabilization. We see so many, even within this list, we see such a range of different motivations that landowners are bringing to the table when they are thinking about conservation projects. And so a lot of you have done a fantastic job of expressing these attitudes and or the motivations of why landowners want to have riparian buffers on their property. And I don't think that that's anything new to this community. We understand these motivations quite well. But when we try to put these in terms of the attitudes of what's underpinning those motivations that you so clearly identified here, a lot of those motivations are rooted in something deeper, in something that is based on these long-standing orientations that landowners or clients have towards their properties. And so what I've shown here is a range of the most common, not necessarily exclusive, but the most common attitudes that people feel that really enhance motivations to do riparian conservation work. And so without feeling too much like a lecture, I want to walk through and talk about just a few of these that are pretty important. I want to start first with this idea of efficacy. Efficacy is what many of you were expressing in the chat box. Efficacy is this idea of what will my project improve? How effective will my project be at changing something in the natural environment, be that habitat conservation or expansion, stabilizing that stream bank? How effective is this project really going to be? And so if landowners have this attitude that, yes, I can make a difference, or my property can make a difference, and that these trees are going to make a difference, that is a very efficacious attitude, and they're going to be more likely to partake in conservation work. A lot of our technical knowledge, things that we know through our stream ecology classes or through our wildlife biology classes that we're trained in, helps to make us effective communicators at these efficacy, towards these efficacy dimensions. So I think that practitioners tend to be quite strong at explaining these relationships that are reasons why we might be brought to the table through grants, through partnerships, to do some conservation work. But there are quite a few other attitudes at play. One that came up in the chat box, and I really appreciated it, was this idea of, will this fit on my property? How does this fit in with my long-standing uses of my property? But also, what will my neighbors think? Or what will people, maybe other people in the ag community, think if I do this? And so we are social beings. We're not just brains on a stick, right? Like, we respond to other people who are around us. And so a landowner's decision to do conservation is very much reflecting how they think they relate to other people or the landscape at large around them. This idea of fit, or if this fits for me, if this fits for me and the social fabric that I'm in, is surprisingly important. We see that landowners who feel like they have tighter friendships and tighter bonds to their neighbors are more likely to consider this normative fit dimension as a really important part of their decision-making process in conservation. The other attitudes on the left side of the screen, attitude, and to some extent related to that, risk aversion, or excuse me, attitudes of innovation and risk aversion. Some landowners just want to try different things. And I always think back to my neighbor growing up. He was that farmer who tried something different every year and was always happy to talk about it to anyone who would want to listen. And so landowners, some of them are more innovative than others. And the landowners that are more willing to just take a slight risk or try something on that innovative spectrum are the ones that we see time and again are more willing to do conservation work on their properties. And that's an attitude that's something that probably we can see in other facets of their life as well. On the green side of things, when we're thinking about environmental attitudes and stewardship attitudes, landowners are really expressing this idea of, do they want to repair or restore or care for their land for their future, for future generations in the stewardship angle, or even increasingly more globally as the world is changing and as we're battling multiple scales of environmental problems. People are aware of that and they want to be good stewards and they want to do the right thing for the environment. And that's an underlying attitude as well. And then, of course, before let me go back, of course, is that idea of profit and profit maximization. And of course, that's an important attitude that we shouldn't look over. A lot of landowners encounter that as a barrier to conservation. And once that barrier is removed through cost sharing initiatives, many of these other attitudes might come to the fore as being really important in their decision. I don't want you to get the impression that this is the only set of attitudes that are out there, and everyone has a unique combination of attitudes that makes it sometimes difficult to tease apart and to think of. But there are some commonalities among people or landowners that can make these attitudes predictable. We can have a pretty good sense of who's going to act based on what attitudes, based on some really important characteristics. The first one is education. People who are well educated or have attained higher levels of formal education tend to be more interested in and more pro-environmentally oriented, and they tend to have more of that knowledge about the biophysical dimensions of riparian conservation that they therefore think it's more effective, and they want to know those efficacy arguments that many of you were mentioning earlier on. So formal education can be a sign of where a landowner could be, what could be motivating a landowner as well. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when it comes to that fit concern or those normative concerns, we often see this within landowners who have been longtime property owners, who are really embedded in their community or who are part of close-knit communities and have some strong tie friendships in the area. That fit's going to matter more to them than perhaps a new landowner who might be just a recent arrival to the region. And of course, the attitudes on the left-hand side tend to be more associated with agricultural production. I make this point because increasingly land is owned in upstate New York by people who are not in intense agricultural production. And so I'm sensing we're going to see a shift in those attitudes over time on innovation of risk aversion and profit maximization tend to not play as prominent of a role as some of the other attitudes that can motivate conservation. But that's just me looking in the crystal ball at this point. Really quickly, I think maybe some of you are asking the so what now. So how do we use this information now that we know the attitudes are important? How do we actually go about identifying what our clients or landowners are thinking? And many of you probably are aware, like sometimes it's obvious. People wear their hearts on their sleeves and they're willing to say quite clearly what is bringing them to the table to work with you. But sometimes we need to ask, or sometimes even when it's obvious, we need to ask a little bit more of the landowners or of clients. And so I really recommend with all of the people you work with to not be bashful in doing a mini interview. You can collect this information without too much of a headache and ask questions like, what do you like most about your setup already? That's pulling in some of, will help you get to the sense of how innovative they might be, how much they are willing to change or not, how much that fit matters if they really like what their setup is and how it fits with the region around them. one of my favorite things to ask is, what are your goals? Like, what do you want to achieve with your property or with your stream? And that really opens up the door for them to say the things that might be driving or motivating them, so that you can identify where within this menu of attitudes they might be speaking from. And then lastly, and this particularly speaks to the fit dimension, how do you see your place as part of the local area? Excuse me. How do you see your property as maybe contributing to water quality problems, benefits, or what you would like to, how you want to contextualize this project within things like land cover, or within maybe picking certain species of trees even. So getting these questions to the landowners, getting that information in your hands can be super beneficial, so that you can talk about riparian conservation with your clients in a way that excites them. I think this broadens the conversation to more than just, oh, this helps pollinators. It does. We like to help pollinators, but that you can be convincing and really cue in on the attitudes that's motivating the landowner to do this kind of work, and therefore tailor the message. As I was gearing up for today's presentation, I saw a webinar from a few weeks ago on videos and how to make videos that profile different projects. It would be fantastic to have videos that really key on certain attitudes, to highlight projects in a way where, if you have landowners who are concerned about if a riparian project is going to look funny, and then to have another landowner who maybe had that concern as well, but that aesthetic dimension was addressed and somehow in that testimonial, so that you can engage potential landowners to the fullest in a way that's really motivating them to do this work with you. And in that, I tipped my hand a little bit. Prepare some like examples. Think about where clients with similar attitudes that you've worked with in the past are located. Think about how you had success with those projects, and really hammer on those points in talking with your newer landowners coming through the door. Ask, how have similar clients overcome constraints or different attitudes in the past? There are people out there who are really good at collecting this kind of information from landowners, from potential landowners as well. And so experts like myself can help to collect attitude information. We can help translate that into strategic planning for your organization. And this type of work is also really great for program evaluation. And so if you are working on grant applications that require some assessment or evaluation component, partnering with a researcher is a great way to have these metrics built into your planning and into your projects. Really quickly, before I wrap up, I just wanted to touch on something that I'm sure many of you are aware of as well. And the times are changing, and so are riparian landowners. When I think of rural America and the Upper Susquehanna Coalition, there are a lot of really big changes that have been happening, or that are happening, or that are going to happen even more in the near future. We're about to see a major shift in America for intergenerational land transfers as the oldest generations pass their land forward. We are experiencing urban outmigration at this point in time. You probably have many new landowners who are popping up in your watersheds. These landowners are coming into a context where there's decreased ag production in the Upper Susquehanna watersheds. Perhaps there's a stronger sustainability mindset amongst new landowners as well. Excuse me. But we're also going to be faced with increasing socioeconomic inequality in our watersheds, where the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and this is going to have an impact on who we work with and how we work with them. But we're also in this context of climate change, and we're working on disaster mitigation and trying to help hopefully increase some carbon sequestration on lands as well. So there are all these things happening, really big forces that are far outside of just the Upper Susquehanna Watershed Coalition's control. And all of this is pointing to many more diverse landowners with a wider range of attitudes compared to the recent past. And so understanding landowner attitudes as the watershed really diversifies with who is active and who's partaking in conservation there is going to be to the conservation organizations' benefit, so that again you can tailor your messages, you can reach a wider audience, and you can recognize and work with this diversity. I just wanted to say thank you. Please ask questions. My email's here if you want to reach out at any point. I'm happy to chat further now or offline. Thanks.
If anyone has questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. Or we're a relatively small group. If you are feeling adventurous and want to unmute yourself and ask the question, feel free. All right, while everyone is getting their questions ready, I would like to say a little bit of thank you. This is our last Watershed Wednesday of 2020, and we just wanted to thank all of our speakers, our participants, viewers, and my other host here with the Upper Susquehanna Coalition could not have done it without you guys. And we just had some really interesting information, I think. So we had fantastic 15 sessions with 20 different speakers, 368 people joining in. That does not include today's numbers, as well as almost 300 folks joining us after the fact. So our information has gotten far and wide, which is exactly what we're hoping, especially when we had to make some changes this year. So thank you everyone who participated and was part of our forum. So cheers to you all, tip of our hats. And we do have some questions. Wonderful. So the question here is, do you conduct research on the most effective way to reach landowners? And if so, is it mailings, emails, videos? We want to know. We want to know. So.
Yeah, that's a great question from Lydia. This is the $1 million question in human dimensions research right now, and as in the past, it was just easy to call someone up on their landline or to mail them something in the mail. And now, especially as landowners are becoming younger and from more diverse backgrounds, this is not always the case. My recommendation, based on the literature and my reading of this, and I don't do communications dissemination research, but I'm in conversation with those people, and what they're telling me is that it's better to have a range of ways to reach people now more than ever. And so some landowners do want things in hard copy, some landowners do want a newsletter, but other landowners want to hear you on social media. And I can tell you that from working with college age students, that's only going to increase over the next few decades, that they're very digitally minded. However, people of generation senior to me are not on Instagram. And so thinking about the age of landowners is really key to how you reach out to them. I like seeing the videos that your organizations are putting together. I think having that social media presence is important for your next wave of outreach, but still having the more traditional newsletters, emails is key. And unfortunately, we're all strapped with time, resources, and financial resources. So it takes a little bit of some asking from within your organization and the people you work with. How are we reaching you? That is a good thing to do. So the combination really is the short answer to that.
Awesome, thank you. And Mike puts out a good point. He says it sounds a lot like Sales 101, get to know your client, motivations, etc. We tend to slip right into program talk without taking the time to identify goals and so forth. Maybe we should be planning a Sales 101 training. Emily, Lydia, what do you guys think? I think that might be useful. We have another question here. So do you have some sort of land ownership information in the region? So demographic information like age, education, distance, local owners, things along those lines?
Yeah, so how do you find some of those characteristics that let us predict these attitudes? And one source of information that I've always found that to be very useful with this are property records and tax records. This is publicly available information in all of your counties. Shenango County is surprisingly hard to get this information from. They do have it in hard copy though, or PDF copy, I believe. But other counties typically have this through a GIS system available online. And you can, through those tax records, figure out the date of sale, so you know how long the landowner has owned that property. Personal information like age and education is harder to come by, but you can tell if they're a local landowner or not by their tax mailing address. And this is a standard in research, is to think about how, where that tax record or tax bill is mailed. If it's within the watershed, they're local. If it's not, then they're probably a seasonal resident or have a property that they visit in the watershed. So I would say, as a starting point, take a look at your tax records and try to hone in on some basics for landowner characteristics that way. Otherwise, that information like age, education, and we can measure these attitudes, that can be done by a landowner survey. I have done quite a bit of this work in upstate New York, around Owasco Lake, in Delaware County. I haven't had a chance to work on one in the Upper Susquehanna watershed yet, but we can pretty effectively model, based on survey responses, what landowners are willing to do conservation work of riparian buffers or other practices on their properties.
Wonderful. Next, Elaine wants to know, well, first, she thinks that riparian buffers are beautiful in all reasons that you mentioned. Have you ever had a farmer or someone say that they might look messy?
Absolutely. This is something that's really common amongst row crop farmers who think like, oh, that shrubbery, it creeps out into the field, it's taking over the landscape. We've got to get our weed whackers on it. We've got to get our brush hogs in there. I think one way to work around that is, and the messy comment comes from environmentally oriented farmers, and that's fine. And the idea of someone being a pro-environment is actually a really big category. I have that as a big circle, not just because that's something I care about, because that's a very important motivator for many people. And someone can be very much for environmental conservation because they want to tackle climate change, which is super different than wanting to conserve wildlife habitat on their property. We know that they're connected through many layers of processes, but that a landowner expressing one idea or the other is a really different set of motivations, or might lead to different talking points on your end. And so, yes, getting back to this messy comment, one of the ways I have found that people who are environmentally oriented, who want to have to better pollinators or to better wildlife habitat, thinking about willows, and particularly black willows, seem to be orderly enough. If there is not such a, because they're fairly managed in terms of how they actually grow physiologically, but also they tend to form a nice hedgerow as well. And so I think that black willows are a species specific way around that messy comment. Of course, we want to get into biologically diverse riparian systems with many different types of species planted there. And I think that's where some of that messiness comes in, when there's so much going on to the eye. But having more black willows planted tends to be something that I've seen landowners are accepting of, and it minimizes that messy aesthetic that turns a few people off. It is a tricky one though, Elaine, thank you.
Thank you so much. And one last comment, it'd be great for the USC to have a database. Some of that might already exist. Know the land, know the people. So I agree, I think that sounds like a great idea, though I'm not the one maintaining the database, so of course I can't be the one to say let's do it. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us today. So thank you everyone, happy holidays, and thank you for joining our forum.